All organisms obtain energy from their environment and use that energy to power life processes, things like growth or movement. All energy for all organisms ultimately comes from the sun. Later in the semester, we'll learn a small exception to that rule, but for now, all energy for life comes from the sun. The green part of this diagram shows the initial capture of sunlight energy by photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is using the energy of sunlight to make organic compounds or food. Photosynthesis occurs in autotrophs, which are organisms that make their own food, and they include plants, algae, some bacteria, and others. The red part of the diagram shows cellular respiration, the burning of organic compounds to release energy. Note that the products of photosynthesis, organic compounds and oxygen, are the starting materials for cellular respiration, which produces water and carbon dioxide. Water and carbon dioxide, in turn, are the starting materials for photosynthesis. The diagram is a little confusing because it has two red arrows to go along with the one green arrow. But that's to remind us that plants, as well as animals, carry out cellular respiration. Photosynthesis happens in chloroplasts of plants, while cellular respiration happens in mitochondria. So this diagram shows us that chemicals basically cycle back and forth between chloroplasts and mitochondria. Chloroplasts produce organic compounds and oxygen, which are then used by mitochondria. In liberating energy from organic compounds, mitochondria produce carbon dioxide and water, which are then used by chloroplasts. So the coupled processes of photosynthesis and cellular respiration can be seen as the cycling of compounds between the mitochondrion and the chloroplast. While compounds cycle, energy is on a one-way trip and is ultimately all dissipated as heat. Sunlight energy is first captured in photosynthesis as chemical energy in organic compounds. The energy of organic compounds works its way through the food chain, going from herbivores to carnivores to decomposers. None of these steps is 100% efficient, and some of the energy is dissipated as heat at each step. Ultimately, an animal is going to use that energy for movement or something else that also generates heat. Or the animal's corpse will rot and break down into carbon dioxide, also releasing heat. Since I'm using the term cellular respiration, I feel like I should make a distinction between the terms cellular respiration and respiration. Cellular respiration is the extraction of energy in the form of ATP by oxidation of fuels, such as glucose, to carbon dioxide with the consumption of oxygen. That's the subject of this lecture. Respiration, on the other hand, is breathing, the exchange of gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide between the body and the atmosphere. This is, of course, critical for cellular respiration. Now that we've talked about where energy comes from, let's talk about where it goes. Organisms need energy for many activities. Here you see a clear example. Animals move, and some animals, like this cheetah, move very fast. But movement is just the tip of the iceberg. Most of an animal's energy needs are for things you can't see, including biosynthesis, making polymers out of monomers, growth, maintaining ion gradients, maintaining body temperature, beating of the heart, and a lot of other things. Putting this all together, an organism's total energy requirements is equal to its basal metabolic rate, or BMR, plus activity. Basal metabolic rate is all the things I just mentioned. It's basically your energy requirements when you're sitting still and not doing anything, and it accounts for 75% of your body's energy requirements. Activity accounts for the other 25%. This tells us in part why it's so difficult to lose weight. Most of our body's energy requirements are outside of our control. That, plus the fact that as energy expenditure increases, our energy intake increases to match. In other words, you eat more when you exercise. Energy requirements are usually measured in calories. Although calorie is an old-fashioned term, the better term is joules, but we'll go with the calorie for now. A calorie, as you may know, is the amount of energy needed to raise 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. This is not to be confused with calorie with a capital C, the unit that's on nutrition labels. This is actually a kilocalorie, 1,000 calories, or the amount of energy needed to raise 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree C. Energy is released from organic compounds by oxidation. Oxidation reactions, together with their sister reactions, reduction, are the flow of electrons from one compound to another. We usually consider oxidation and reduction reactions together and use the shorthand term redox. The oxidation of methane, CH4, is a good example. It's not a reaction that we have to worry about in the context of this biology class, but it's a good example of what oxidation means and how it happens. In this case, methane reacts with oxygen to form carbon dioxide and water with the release of energy, which you already know if you cook or heat with natural gas. Note that the complete oxidation of any organic compound generates only carbon dioxide and water. That's true of methane or gasoline, which contains octane, and it's true for the fuels we think of in biology, like glucose and fatty acids. To oxidize means to lose or lose control of electrons. To reduce means to gain or gain control of electrons. Let's take a closer look at this reaction and see what that means. But to help, keep in mind the mnemonic device LEO-GER. Lose electrons oxidation, gain electrons reduction. Here is the oxidation of methane once again. This time I've tried to show the electrons in some of the compounds. But once again, it's methane plus 2 oxygen yields carbon dioxide plus 2 water. Take a look at methane and you'll see that the carbon is sharing electrons with hydrogen. You could say that carbon and hydrogen are competing for those shared electrons. When carbon and hydrogen compete for electrons, there's no clear winner. Remember, they're both about equivalent in terms of electronegativity. The electrons are evenly shared by carbon and hydrogen, and methane is a nonpolar compound. Now look at the carbon dioxide on the right side of the equation. Here, carbon is sharing electrons with oxygen. Oxygen will win that competition. The electrons spend more time with oxygen than with carbon, and carbon dioxide is a polar compound. In other words, carbon has lost control of electrons, or carbon has been oxidized. Carbon dioxide represents carbon in its most oxidized form. By the same token, oxygen has gained control of electrons, or oxygen has been reduced. Keep in mind that whenever one molecule is oxidized, another molecule is reduced. The reactions go hand in hand. The electrons flow from one atomic center to another. One last thing to say is that electrons generally flow in pairs, and they're usually accompanied by protons. Keep in mind that 2 electrons and 2 protons make 2 hydrogen atoms. So if you consider the molecule H2O, it represents electrons flowing from carbon to oxygen, and those electrons are accompanied by protons. The result of this electron flow is the production of water. Now let's take a look at redox reactions in a more biologically relevant context. Here we have the summary equation of cellular respiration. You are required to know it, so take a good look. Glucose plus 6 oxygen yields 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water. When glucose gets oxidized in cellular respiration, electrons are flowing from carbon ultimately to oxygen. Carbon gets oxidized, oxygen gets reduced. The flow of electrons from carbon to oxygen releases energy, or you could say that it's an exergonic flow of electrons. That's why oxidation of glucose can fill all the body's energy needs. With photosynthesis, it's just the opposite. Photosynthesis starts with carbon dioxide and builds it into organic compounds like glucose. In this case, carbon gets reduced and that takes energy. That energy comes from the sun. So flow of electrons away from carbon releases energy, and flow of electrons to carbon requires energy. Okay, back to cellular respiration. The energy released by the oxidation of glucose is captured as ATP. So a more complete summary equation for cellular respiration looks like this, and shows that some of the energy is captured as ATP. 32 molecules of ATP are produced per molecule of glucose oxidized, a good number to know. Keep in mind that when I say make ATP, I mean the phosphorylation of ADP to ATP. You can calculate the efficiency of the process overall because we know the amount of energy that glucose contains and the amount of energy that ATP contains. When we do the calculation, we find that about 34% of the energy is captured as ATP. Nothing to write home about in terms of efficiency. It really doesn't compare well to technologies that we use ourselves. Keep in mind, though, that some of that inefficiency is due to the release of heat, which is not exactly wasted but goes into maintaining body temperature. Production of ATP is possible because the oxidation of glucose happens stepwise, not all at once. When your car burns gasoline, oxidation happens all at once. There's an explosion, and that explosion is what drives your car. In biological systems, there are no explosions. Oxidations happen stepwise, so the energy can be captured as ATP at discrete steps along the way. This requires that the electrons be captured in an intermediate form as they flow from carbon to oxygen. The intermediate that carries electrons during cellular respiration is NADH. It's not important what NADH stands for. We just need to realize that NADH is a way of temporarily capturing electrons on their way from carbon to oxygen. NADH is formed when NAD+ binds two electrons. Remember that in biological oxidations, electrons are usually accompanied by protons, which together make a hydrogen atom. So we can write an equation like this: NAD+ plus 2H, which represents two electrons and two protons, yields NADH and H+. So this NADH is carrying two electrons. NADH acts as an intermediate in carrying electrons that will ultimately flow to oxygen. Here's another way to look at it. Electrons, represented by the E-, flow first to NAD+ to make NADH, and the NADH gives up electrons to oxygen. Oxygen accepts the electrons and protons to make water. NADH is an intermediate both in terms of where it's carrying electrons and in terms of the energy of those electrons. The electrons in organic compounds are high energy. As they flow to oxygen, the electrons are giving up energy, with the electrons in water being low energy. The electrons in NADH are of intermediate energy. Now that we've taken a look at the sources and uses of energy for organisms, we'll turn our attention to the specific reactions of cellular respiration in the next video.